and then move your finger back. You can do that without gagging, but as you move back towards your soft palate, you might trigger your gag reflex. It doesn't hurt. It's just a little, gagging. And then you can feel your soft palate, all right? And the soft palate doesn't have any bony structure supporting it like the hard palate does. So, okay, there we go. So let's talk about the pharyngeal segment first. You might not realize it, but the pharyngeal segment, really starting at the level of the glottis and going up through the oral cavity, not counting the hard palate, is a flexible muscular tube, right? So it's a tube, it's an open airway. And the walls of it, as we're going to see, is made up of muscle. It extends, as I said before, from the larynx up to about the base of the skull, which is, right about there on this slide. The back and side walls are connective tissue and muscle. The front walls, the epiglottic cartilage, the base of the tongue, right? Base of the tongue forms part of the wall, but the tongue is all muscle. And part of the, kind of the superior wall is the velum. So you have this, I have these all colored in blue so you can see. So we're really talking about, now the nasal passage isn't just this great big open area, you got the separation in there, but it is open. It goes up into your sinuses in here. Okay, again, the part on the schematic is this part right here. So what we're calling the pharyngeal segment runs from, again, the glottis to about the base of the skull. Now, the oral segment is the oral segment is really the oral cavity. And the oral cavity really is another tube, right? But it's a kind of a different shape too. It's definitely an open space and open volume. But the oral cavity tends to be a very adjustable tube. And this part of the resonating cavity really goes from the top of that pharyngeal segment. If you look at this right here, so it's kind of from the top of the pharyngeal segment out to the lips. And then we, intuitively that the structures that form the walls of the oral segment are the velum, or the soft palate, the hard palate, the gums, the upper gums and the lower gums, really, the upper teeth, and the lips and the roof of the mouth. Now the floor, tongue, mandible, lower gums, lower teeth, lower lip. And then the side walls are made up by your cheeks and your upper and lower jaws. Again, gums and lips. So the oral cavity. Now, next semester you're gonna get this more when you start talking about acoustics. But the thing that you have to realize about the oral cavity is it is a container, right? And within that container, you can shape this container in different ways by moving. What are the structures that move? You can move your velum. You can't really move your hard palate. You can move your teeth up and down. It goes with your jaw, right? You're moving your mandible. Your teeth are carried with it. Your cheeks and your lips are all very movable. The velum is very movable. And that's what changes the size and shape of the container. And it's the size and shape of that open container that's important for speech production and for articulation in the case that we're talking about now. So you use these articulators to change the shape of this resonating cavity. And that's the oral segment. Now the nasal segment is interesting because the nasal segment, you can't see it in this picture because it's a lateral view, but it's actually a double passage. So your nasal septum, the thing that separates your two nostrils, continues up for a while until you get into the nasopharynx, and then you have more of an open cavity. But this one extends from the top of the pharynx to the nostril. It's a very complex, more narrow tube than the oral cavity. The roof of the nasal segment is the skull bone. So right up here at the top of your nasal cavity is the skull bone that really is separating the nasal cavity from your brain cavity, right? So the box that's holding your brain is the lower part of the brain And the floor of the nasal segment is the bones of the hard palate. So the hard palate is right here. See, here's the bony hard palate, right in here. Here's where the soft palate sits. The sides of the nose are referred to as the conchae, which is right here. Okay. So those are the sides of that nasal segment. And the soft palate moves around a lot. You probably already talked about this in phonetics, and we're going to talk about this a lot in this class, is the soft palate is very important for either allowing airflow to be directed through the nasal cavity. So in this position, if you keep your soft palate lowered, you allow air to flow into the nasal cavity and out through the nose. But if you contract certain muscles, we're going to be identifying those muscles today, and you take that soft palate and you move it kind of up and back, that's what you do. And it makes contact with this posterior pharyngeal wall. You move it up and back. So you close off that opening between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, or and from the pharyngeal cavity and the nasal cavity. And if you close off that opening, no airflow can be directed through the nasal cavity. It can only be directed out through the oral cavity. And we do that all the time. Your velum, you'd be surprised. I'm going to show some lateral head x-ray, some motion lateral head x-rays so that you can see the motion of the velum. It's in constant movement. And so is the tongue, for that matter. So during connected speech, you've got a lot of activity that goes on in the supralaryngeal resonating cavities to change the size and shape of the cavity. And basically, think of it this way. If you allow air to flow through your nasal cavity, then you allow that nasal cavity to become a resonator, right? You allow it to become a resonator. So when you do or you're directing air through the nasal cavity, and those air molecules start resonating, and that's what creates that nasal sound. And most of the time, of course, you want it if you're producing nasals. You don't want it if you're producing vowels and you're producing things like fricatives and stops. Okay, so I kind of did this, but just in summary, so in general, the upper airway can be changed in shape through adjustments of what's known as the articulators. So the upper airway, which really is comprised of like that pharyngeal segment, the oral segment, the nasal segment. You're moving your velum around, your mandible, your tongue, lips, and nostrils, in effect. And those are the structures that modulate the airstream. And this is an important term right here. These structures modulate the airstream. And this is called articulation. So that modulation of the airstream is articulation. So first of all, you need something powering the system, which is your respiratory system. 2, you need that sound source, right, that creates or the vibratory source that creates the sound. And then that sound is transmitted up through the oral cavity. And then that airstream that we're controlling through our subglottal pressure and our laryngeal valve, that airstream then gets modulated, and that's where articulation takes place. If you don't have the airstream, you can't articulate, right? If you don't have the aerodynamic events that you need, if you can't build up air pressure and airflow, then speech sounds won't be speech sounds. Busy figure, but it's a really good one. It's a really old figure that occurs in a lot of phonetics textbooks, identifying all of these different parts of the supraglottal airway. And we're going to talk about these parts in more detail, but this is a figure that very often is used to define place of articulation, which I know you have done in phonetics, right? Have you seen this figure before? That same figure? One person said no, and one person said yes. That's so interesting how that happens. So it's, or a similar figure. So, okay, so the lips, obviously, right? The upper lip, the lower lip, and then you have the teeth right here and right here, the incisors. And then right behind the teeth is that alveolar ridge. Let's just start with the soft palate. So you have the alveolar ridge, and then this is different parts of the hard palate, and then you have, that's the end of the hard palate, posterior end of the hard palate, and then here's that velum, right? And remember, this opening between the oral cavity, oropharyngeal cavities, and the nasal segment is controlled by the velum. And I'll just put this term out now, and we're going to talk about it again. That opening isn't just a single dimensional opening, but it's called the velopharyngeal port, right? The velopharyngeal port. And so it's that opening between the velum and the posterior pharyngeal wall, and the lateral pharyngeal walls too, for that matter. And then we control whether we allow the nasal cavity to be part of articulation or not. We'll come back to this one. You know, you can see obviously the tongue. Now look at where just to show you where things are. Here's the hyoid bone, right? In your neck, and then right above the tip or the top, you know, that leaf-shaped epiglottic cartilage, the leaf shape comes up about here, but here's the base of the tongue. And then you have this little area in here that some things can get caught in, but we're not going to talk about that right now. We'll see it on some of the films we look at. If you have swallowing problems, food tends to get caught right in there. That's key. And it stays in there. It can stay in there for a while. Okay, so we won't go into that one because I'm not going to talk about swallowing. Tongue tip, tongue blade, more to the back of the tongue, and then of course the root of the tongue is down here. All right. So as far as the overview, you guys know, now this is what we're talking about. Those structures and the function of those structures are this next segment of this course. And we're going to start with the supraglottal anatomy. Right? So we're going to do anatomy of those pharyngeal tubes and the tongue and the lips and so on. And then we're going to get into speech sounds and how those are articulated. And remember, this section of the course is the section. It's not separated into anatomy and physiology for that final test. They're both on the final, which is on December 9th. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
8th or 9th. 9th. Okay. All right. So any questions about where we're going here? Good to have that overview so you know. We can start with I'm going to start with the pharyngeal anatomy. I think that's good. What?
Question final? It's just on the last.
What does it say on the syllabus? I have to stick to what I said on the syllabus, otherwise I'd say I think about it. It's, you know, it's not formally cumulative, but with this class it's hard for it not to be, you know, because I'll ask certain questions that you have to know about laryngeal and respiratory function. But no, I'm not going to take specific questions from the first part of the class that don't relate to the last part. So in effect, it's going to be 50 questions on this last section. Any other questions? Right, so
I would just like not study and just spend every day crying.
Most of this is pretty easy to visualize the anatomy. Oh, and I guess somebody asked if I did say I'm doing a review session on Tuesday. All right. Yeah, it looks like it's in the cheek, but it's not really inside the cheek. This is referred to, we're talking about the muscles that make up the wall of the pharyngeal tube, right? So these muscles in this series of drawing are really, you can picture behind the mandible, you have that tube that extends up from the larynx up to the base of the skull. And these are the muscles, just so you get the big picture. These muscles wrap around kind of from front to back. and form the muscular wall of the pharynx. So you're looking at one side of this muscle wrapping around. This is the lateral view, so you're only getting one side. And the first one is referred to as the superior constrictor. So it's the highest muscle in the pharyngeal wall. And it's at about the level of the nasopharynx. So at that, about the level in the pharyngeal, at the level of the nasopharynx. The origin of the muscle is complex in that the origin is from some bones of the skull, which is up in this area right here, and then some bones of the mandible. So the origin is over here, and you have some origin in the sides of the tongue. And then the muscle wraps around in kind of a half circle. It wraps around and inserts into a structure that's referred to as the dorsal pharyngeal midline raphe. Now what is that? The pharyngeal raphe. It's a long strip of non-muscular tissue which separates the pharynx really into a right half and a left half. So you have this going up the posterior wall. It runs vertically, superior to inferior, in the middle of the posterior pharyngeal wall. And these muscles, the constrictors that we're talking about, are going to wrap around. They insert into the posterior pharyngeal wall into this dorsal pharyngeal raphe. Now, the function, the non-speech function for the constrictor, this superior constrictor, is for swallowing. So when you swallow, the muscle contracts, fibers shorten, and if you picture these muscles wrapping around and they shorten, what are they going to do to that pharyngeal tube? They're going to make it more narrow, right? And so the non-speech function is to narrow the tube, and the speech function is also to narrow the pharyngeal tube. So in effect, we say it narrows the pharynx. But what I'm saying for short is it's narrowing, it's making the pharyngeal tube smaller.
So are most of these going to be unpaired muscles because they wrap around? Because it says that it separates into the right and left halves. So would it be a single or would it be bilateral?
Never thought of that. I think they're usually talked about as single.
Okay.
You know, because when you look at the superior constrictor, it's always talked about as just the
Like, 'cause it
superior
wraps.
constrictor.
Okay.
Okay, so that's at the level about the nasopharynx, but it's in that pharyngeal segment. Now the middle constrictor is immediately inferior to the superior constrictor. And so now this constrictor, this muscle, is at the level of the oral pharynx, right? So it's kind of at the back of the oral segment, so it's at that level of the pharyngeal tube. The origin of the muscle, look at it right here, where you see the origin is really from the hyoid bone, and there would be bilateral origin on the hyoid. The muscle wraps around and again inserts into the dorsal pharyngeal midline raphe, again, but lower, at the level of the oral pharynx. So what's the function of this muscle? To narrow the pharynx. Or in other words, to make the pharyngeal tube smaller. The inferior constrictor, again, a similar muscle where it has its origins. Now this time the origins are at the level of the larynx, so it's referred to as the laryngopharynx, or that pharyngeal area right above the larynx. All right, so the pharyngeal tube right above the larynx, and you can see actually through the larynx, here's the cricoid cartilage, and you might even get some muscle fibers down to the first tracheal ring. So this is the origin of the inferior constrictor. Here's the list of structures where the muscle fibers attach at the origin point: cricoid cartilage, thyroid cartilage, anterior and lateral arch of the cricoid. Fibers run in a semicircle and insert into the dorsal pharyngeal midline raphe. Again, the function is to narrow the laryngopharynx. Now, this next slide I like because it really shows you the relationship between the three pharyngeal constrictors, which is the one in blue is the superior constrictor, the one in red is the middle constrictor, and the one in green, which is really the most extensive constrictor, is the inferior constrictor. And the thing that you should note in here is that the fibers, as they're coursing around into the back and they're making up this pharyngeal wall, the fibers cross over with each other. They intermingle, right? Especially in the posterior aspects of the pharyngeal wall. They're all attaching to that midline raphe. Now, the thing about swallowing is when you swallow, and when you take the class in swallowing, typically what you do is when you're chewing, you realize that when you chew, this is the other reason it's important to keep those lips sealed, to get a lip seal when you're chewing, is you are taking your food and you're mashing it as you're chewing, and your tongue is mashing it, and you're forming it into what's referred to as a bolus. It's a little clump of food, and then you take that little clump of food and you shoot it back into the oral pharynx. I don't know that it's shot back, but you take that clump of food, you move it into the oral pharynx very quickly, and then what are you going to do? You have some constrictor activity to then move that. It squeezes the food down. It's, it's like a sphincter action, and then it shoots it into the esophagus. So the top of as you're doing this, the top of the esophagus has to open. There's a sphincter muscle at the top of the esophagus. So you get that little bolus of food, and then the top of the esophagus opens. And what are you doing to the larynx? You're sphinctering the larynx closed, right? So that you're protecting your airway, and then the food gets shot into the esophagus. And then as soon as you get the food into the esophagus, the esophageal sphincter closes again, but the airway opens, right? So this is why you can't breathe when you are in the middle of a swallow, because you sphincter closed the airway, and you can't make the vocal folds. You can't breathe and you can't phonate, all right? But it's just instantaneous. It's just for the amount of time that it takes to swallow. But it's the constrictors that are responsible for kind of, after you get the food through some tongue action and some other muscle action, you shoot it back to the oral pharynx back here. Then you sphincter it down so it goes into the top of the esophagus, which is right about here. And so you're using those muscles to move the food around. Okay. But for speech production, we're using these pharyngeal constrictors to modify, again, the shape of that pharyngeal tube, depending on what you want to produce. Now, for normal speakers, I don't think there's a lot of action going on at the level of the inferior constrictor while you're speaking. I mean, it might be controlling the larynx to a certain extent. But singers modify the cavity right above the larynx to create an additional resonant cavity, which is really interesting. It's one of the reasons that singers can sing as loud as they do. But so they're manipulating laryngopharynx in ways that just, speakers don't do. Okay, any questions about the constrictors? Straightforward, right? I always feel like the anatomy is really, I know when you first walked in the class you said, oh God, anatomy, but it really is the easy part. So now the stylopharyngeus, which is bilateral on both sides of the neck. The origin is the stylopharyngeus. The origin is the styloid process right up here of the temporal bone. The muscle runs down and inserts into. Now you can't actually see this happening, but it's inserting into fibers of the medial and inferior constrictors. Okay, and the function, you can see that it's if you have this muscle that runs here. Right? It's running from that styloid process, and then it's running down to the inferior constrictor, which is at the level of the larynx. It's wider at the top, and it goes more narrow, right? And so when the muscle contracts and the fibers shorten, it'll pull the pharynx upwards and outward. And so this muscle is a muscle that we use for expanding the cavity or making the cavity of the pharynx bigger. Or in other words, kind of expanding the pharyngeal walls. And that's the bilateral stylopharyngeus. Okay, now the palatopharyngeus. First, let's get the view, because the view is important. You actually have a frontal section. So they've taken the person and they've made the slice this way. So you've separated the front of the head and neck from the back of the head and neck. And now, but it says you have a posterior view. So you're looking at these structures from the back. So in other words, the thing you want to identify right away is here is the velum, and the soft palate would be right up here. You're looking at the velum and the soft palate from behind the person's head. You can see it that way. Okay, so that's the view. So the palatopharyngeus muscle, sometimes this muscle is referred to as the posterior fascial pillar. If you look, I'm going to go back up to that slide that we looked at. Open your mouth and hold your tongue down and say ah. This slide. So that was in the last slideshow. But it's important. I want you to see that slide again. It was in the intro, and I think I closed that. Okay, now I'll just use my pointer on this. So now you've got a frontal view of some of the same structures, right? So here's the velum. And then notice right from the velum, if you look in your mouth tonight, please do this. And locate this. This is the anterior fascial pillar, right? That's kind of a direct connection right up into the velum. And you can see that. And then if you have regular tonsils, you can't see your tonsils, your palatine tonsils, but those lie between this anterior fascial pillar on the side. And then you're going to see a little folded tissue behind the anterior, which is the posterior fascial pillar. So that muscle that we're talking about that forms the posterior fascial pillar kind of arches up and helps form the side of the pharynx, all right? And that is the posterior fascial pillar. Now, let's get back to that muscle. Which is the palatopharyngeus muscle. It's bilateral, so it's on both sides. When you look in your oral cavity, you're going to see it on both sides. And the origin of this muscle is at the palatoaponeurosis. Okay, so now what's the palatoaponeurosis? It's a thin, again, non-muscular, kind of a stiff structure that attaches the hard and the soft palate, and the muscles that are important for closing the soft palate or elevating that soft palate attach right there. So the palatoaponeurosis is like a tendon. I'm not sure if it's a tendon or not. I should look that up. Okay, so the origin would be right here, right? This is that attachment point between the soft palate and the hard palate as looking from behind, and then the other muscle would be over here, of course, and go this way, forming that arch. But you can see how it forms the posterior fascial pillar, which is why you want to look at it from behind, because you can see that muscle from behind. So you have the muscle on the left and the muscle on the right. Now, what's it going to do? Imagine those muscle fibers contracting. They shorten. It's going to draw those lateral pharyngeal walls. In effect, that's forming the lateral pharyngeal wall is going to be drawn inward, and then what would the function of that be? to narrow the pharyngeal cavity or draw those lateral pharyngeal walls, more toward the midline. Okay. We're going to see some repetition between muscles. Did you get the picture of this muscle? That posterior, yes.
So you said the posterior fascial fluid is the same thing as this, right?
Yes.
This is just another name.
I have it right there. Posterior fascial pillar is the palatopharyngeal muscle. Yes. The common name for it is the posterior fascial pillar. Okay, any questions about this series? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's not muscular. The palatal aponeurosis is non-muscular. Okay. So here's the pharyngeal anatomy. And let's find this other one. The velopharyngeal anatomy. I talked about this a little. These are the muscles in the anatomy that deal with the soft palate and the relationship to the pharyngeal wall. So I already described to you how that soft palate is elevated. It basically moves upward and backward, and it's very important. This anatomy is going to be important for closure of the velopharyngeal port, right? And I already named that for you. That opening between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity is referred to as the velopharyngeal port. And we're going to see that these muscles are going to run from the skull bones, and insert into that soft palate. Now, before we start talking about the muscle, I want you to have this clear picture. Again, here's the other thing to do when you're looking in your mouth tonight. The other activity. Open wide, stick your tongue out. Get a really good light, because you won't be able to see in it very well, so you need a good light. Yeah, if you have to get a flashlight, stick a flashlight in there, and you're doing your own kind of self-exam, oral exam. And you're going to go open wide, stick out your tongue, you're going to go, ah, ah, ah. And I want you to stop between each ah. Okay? Now, when you phonate the ah, and you get vocal fold vibration, right, your soft palate is going to move up and back. And when you do that glottal stop in between, ah, the palate is going to drop down in between. But you got to really stop to have that happen. So you're going to watch your palate going up and back, up and back. You can do it fast. You can go ah, 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 ah. It's moving the whole time. It's moving up and back, up and back, up and back. So watch that. That's controlling that opening between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, and that opening is called the velopharyngeal port. But it's not only from front to back, it's also from side to side, right? The port is multidimensional. So the pharyngeal walls have to interact. We're going to see that the pharyngeal walls will interact with the movement of the velum. So if you are, and why is this so important for a speech pathologist, right? If you are a typical speaker or normal, you don't have any kind of neurological involvement. If the soft palate is all muscle and the pharyngeal walls comprise the muscle, if you have some sort of neurological problem, you're not going to get velopharyngeal closure. And if you don't get velopharyngeal closure, what are you going to sound like?
Nasal.
You're going to be hypernasal all the time. And we will play a tape of this young man. He was a biker, wasn't he? He was one of those kids that did a lot of biking on this little bike. Do you remember him from last year? We have these YouTube videos. We'll show them again. And he had an accident on his bike because they were doing tricks, right? And he had an accident on his bike and got closed head trauma, and which meant that he had a very widespread neurological damage. But he was also very, he was very techno-literate, and he started making videos of himself immediately after the accident and for about a year afterwards. And so he has this chronicle of what happened to his body and his speech due to this closed head trauma and how it progressed over a year. But he became very hypernasal because he didn't have the control over the muscles, over his oropharyngeal muscles. So he couldn't close his velopharyngeal port and became very hypernasal sounding. He couldn't control the muscles in his lips or his tongue either, so he also became dysarthric. So many times when you're, as a speech pathologist, if you're listening to a dysarthric speaker, there's lots of things going on. And with closed head trauma, you can compare some of the nerves, some of the pathways that go to the cranial nerves, which we, the nerve that fires up the muscles in the larynx, and then the spinal nerves that are controlling the muscles in your thorax and abdomen, and you can have this multi-level involvement if somebody has closed head trauma. Now, as a speech pathologist, why is that so? Somebody walks in and they're dysarthric, and you say, wow, they're dysarthric, they're hypernasal, they're having problems with voicing, and they're having problems with respiratory support. That's what happens when you have this extensive neurological damage that occurs during closed head trauma. It means all three of the systems are involved, and people sound very different. But it's hard, if you don't know this ahead of time, sometimes it's very hard to identify. You have articulatory problems, you're hypernasal, you have voicing problems, respiratory problems. You have to listen for all of that. And I used to have this instructor at University of Wisconsin. His name was Ron Netzel. And he made, if YouTube right now, he'd be on YouTube. He made this video. He could do this thing where he would talk and just be dysarthric. And then he would add in hypernasality, and he'd do the same speech task again, and he'd add in the hypernasality. And then he'd add in very short utterances and impaired breath grouping and stuff like that. And he would go from mildly impaired to, severely impaired. I wish I have that video. It really is on videotape. It's not on a DVD or anything like that. So, yeah. Okay, so we're going to now talk about that anatomy that's controlling that soft palate, which is just really important for speech. Okay, this is another posterior view. So they've taken these, they kind of excise, it's a schematic, right? It's a drawing of how this would go. And you're looking at the soft palate from kind of above and behind. So there it is. These are bones of the skull up here. Here's the muscle that we're talking about this time. It would be bilateral, of course, the levator palatini. And you can see the other side would be, attaching to the palate. So the muscle is actually, the origin of this muscle is the medial side of the eustachian tube. You know what the eustachian tube is? That's that little air tube that runs from the level of the nasopharynx, maybe to oropharynx, and then runs into the middle ear. And this is the tube that you control when you swallow or you're chewing gum on an airplane, and you start feeling that pressure build up in the middle ear, and you swallow. And what you do is you open the eustachian tube when you swallow, and it equalizes the pressure between your middle ear and the oral cavity. Right? Because pressure flows from regions of high pressure to regions of low airflow. You get a little flow through that tube, it equalizes the pressure. So anyhow, the medial side of the eustachian tube, and then it inserts into the palatoaponeurosis, and importantly, the top of the posterior aspect of the soft palate. So you're looking at the top of the soft palate, right? And so you have these two muscles that are running from higher up, and what will that do? It will pull up and kind of out on the soft palate. So it's going to elevate it and move it back. So this is an important muscle for elevating the soft palate. And this is a main muscle that is responsible, this is a term that's important, that's responsible for the oralization gesture. So what's the oralization gesture? It's pulling up on the soft palate, which means it's closing the velopharyngeal port. So it means that you're going to direct all of your airflow through the oral cavity. You're not going to allow air to go through the nasal cavity. So therefore, it's called the oralization gesture. No air through the nasal cavity, only through the oral cavity. So you're going to orally produce sounds. Okay, I already defined those, but I just put them on again for you. So the levator palatini is a main muscle responsible for closure of the velopharyngeal cord.
So this is another frontal view from the back.
It's a frontal cut, basically, from the back.
Okay.
Or, yes, we could view it that way. They just excised everything. It's a frontal, yeah. But it's from the back. It's pulling, it's attached to the top of your soft palate, all right? And so then when the bilateral muscle contracts, it pulls up on the soft palate, it pulls up and out on the soft palate that way. Okay. Yes, that's frontal. Cut it there, and then look at it from behind, right? So the cut is there, and then you're looking at it from behind. Okay. Now here's the superior constrictor again. This is important. And why is the superior important? I'm not going to go over the whole thing again, but let's talk about the function of the superior constrictor. Constrictor, remember, is at the level of the nasopharynx. So when the superior constrictor contracts and narrows the pharyngeal tube at the level of the nasopharynx, what is it contributing to? Velopharyngeal port closure, right? So if you think about this, so here's the pharyngeal tube, right? And the pharyngeal tube goes like this. It gets bigger or it gets smaller. And it goes all the way around, right? And then you have the velum, which is like this. That's making, the velum is doing this. Okay, let me do it from this side. The velum is doing this. And then at the same time, the velum is going up and back and closing off. You contract that superior constrictor, what's it going to do? It's going to close around the velum. So it helps close from the front to the back, and it helps close it from side to side, and probably a little bit from front to back this way. So you get this port, you get the squeezing. It's not like a sphincter squeezing, but it's a squeezing, and then you get that, and you get good closure. But you got to have control of these constrictors, and you've got to have control of the levator palatini to get that good closure. So there's the superior constrictor, important for velopharyngeal closure. And so therefore, then I say it's important to the oralization gesture because it's moving really the lateral pharyngeal walls. Yeah.
But if it's like, it's up here, it's closer to your nose, because you don't, when the pharynx is enclosed, it doesn't like touch the velum, right? Because then wouldn't you be blocking
It won't.
airflow?
When the velum moves up and back, it'll touch the posterior pharyngeal wall, and the lateral walls of the pharynx get more narrow, and so you actually do have a closure
Oh, it like
all the way.
circles
Yeah, it closes, it squeezes around it.
around. Okay.
So it moves like this, it moves up and back. We'll see the videos and you can see the way it moves. It actually kind of moves like this. And this knee goes up and makes contact with the posterior pharyngeal wall. And then at the same time that that's happening, you get the walls of the pharynx narrowing. And so it closes around it. Okay. So there we go, the superior constrictor. I just put that in again because, why? So you can see that you might get some movement of the middle constrictor right there. Remember, these fibers are, and the middle constrictor goes pretty high up. So that the middle constrictor might also help with that velopharyngeal port closure. Okay, and then again, the palatopharyngeus muscle, which is we're still talking about that posterior fascial pillar, that if you view it as a lateral pharyngeal muscle here and here. When those muscles contract and shorten, that will narrow the pharynx more laterally than posteriorly, right? So you get help from these muscles too. So again, the palatopharyngeus muscle is important to the oralization gesture. Anything that helps you close off the oral cavity from the nasal cavity is part of the oralization gesture. So we're talking about all of those muscles that either narrow the pharynx or elevate the soft palate. Now, the palatoglossus muscle. This looks like it's coming down right in the middle of your tongue, but it's not. It's way off on the side, okay? And now you've got this lateral view of the palatoglossus. So it's already, you should know that it's, the origin is the palatoaponeurosis. So it's kind of at that point between the hard palate and the soft palate. It goes down and inserts laterally into the sides of the tongue. Well, the function of the muscle is if the tongue is fixed, it'll pull the velum down, right? If the velum is fixed, it can actually help curl the sides of the tongue up, towards the back. Well, this muscle has an out. Let's assume that we fix the tongue because you want to pull the velum down, right? And if you start pulling down on the velum, that's going to open the velopharyngeal port, and that's what we refer to as the nasalization gesture. So in other words, you're going to allow air to flow into that nasal cavity, and then that cavity is going to have a resonance, a presence, and we're going to nasalize our sounds, and so that's referred to as the nasalization gesture. The tensor veli palatini. Again, you're looking at a posterior view. Here's the velum again. And the origin of the tensor veli palatini is the lateral side of the eustachian tube, so out towards the sides. Parts of the sphenoid bone, which is that skull bone that's making up the roof of the nasal cavity. So it's up, the origin is, towards the roof of the nasal cavity. It would be bilateral. Inserts, it's not giving you a great look of the insertion, is into the palatoaponeurosis. Now, if you keep the palate in a stable position, could help open the eustachian tube. This is the muscle that helps open the eustachian tube. So when you swallow and you open that tube on the pharynx end of the tube, it's the tensor veli that's doing that. Some people think it might be important for velopharyngeal function, but it might help a little bit, but it's not a real important muscle for elevating the palate.
Is this deeper than the levator palatine, or where is it?
I don't know if it's deeper. I think it's more posterior or anterior. It would be more posterior or anterior, but to me it looks more anterior here, but I'm not sure. Okay, now the sulfingopharyngeus. Okay, again, you've got a posterior view. Now, this is so interesting to look at these pictures. I don't love these pictures, but it's the only way to look at these muscles. This is the aperture into the larynx from behind. This is the soft palate from behind, and this would kind of be the top of the soft palate. The eustachian tube, they're showing you kind of where the eustachian tube is up in here. And the muscle is going to blend with the palatopharyngeus muscle. But just look at where it runs. It's this bilateral muscle. It's going to contract and shorten. It could draw the lateral pharyngeal walls medially, which would help with what gesture? It draws the lateral pharyngeal walls medially. It would help with the oralization gesture, or closure of the velopharyngeal port. That's right. So there's the sulfingopharyngeus. This I put on for you. You can take it or leave it. Find a better one. But it's basically looking at, again, you're looking at this from behind, and you can see where it's putting together and in all of the muscles. This is the opening. If this is the epiglottis right here, that's the opening down into the larynx from there. And this would be the oral cavity, going out the oropharynx here. Here's the uvula and the soft palate would be in here. So it's showing you the relationship between the muscles that we just presented. So study the figure so you know it. This is another one that shows you the muscles together. So I put this in for you. Or look up one that might be good for you to look at the relationship between the pharyngeal muscles and the velar elevators in effect. Oh, that's what you're going to do tonight. And you're going to watch for, here's the uvula. There's the soft palate. Now you're looking at the bottom of the soft palate in this view. Here's an anterior fascial pillar. Okay? There's a tonsil, and then you should see the posterior fascial pillar behind your tonsil. Okay, just pictures for your information. So now we're ready. See, this always goes really fast, the anatomy of the supraorbital anatomy. I think now we're ready for the tongue. Okay, so now let's do the anatomy of the tongue. This is really, these are kind of gross locations in terms of different parts of the tongue. It's not indicating any kind of muscle. So the very tip of your tongue is called the tip of your tongue. And then right behind the tip of your tongue is the blade. And then somewhere starting in about here is the dorsum of the tongue. And then way back, you've seen the root of the tongue on some of the video strokes that we've looked at when you're looking at the larynx. And so the root of the tongue is way back in terms of posterior and quite low in the oral cavity. So those are the four major divisions of the tongue. Some landmarks that we're going to refer to are the frenulum of the tongue. Is that everybody, if you lift up your tongue right now, the median fold of that mucous membrane is on the inferior surface. Put your tongue way up and then it kind of stretches. That's the frenulum. That's that little piece of tissue. Okay. The mucous membrane that covers the tongue is called the propria lingua. All right. So in other words, that kind of propria lingua, the cover over the tongue. The median fibrous septum extends the length of the tongue internally. So you can see where the median septum is. Stick out your tongue and you can see, right, the right and the left hands. I don't think you can see it from. Can you see it sticking out your tongue?
No, little.
I can't. My nose is in the way. So,
Me too.
Yeah, okay, so stick it again tonight,
No,
look
my
at
nose
those
is
parts. So, and that's that fibrous septum or that separation
Everyone's like
between the
sitting
right
there
and
for
left
looking cross-eyed.
sides
It's so
is this one
funny.
right here. Important because these structures, muscles are going to insert into some of these structures that are, the non-muscular structures. So you got those three: the frenulum, the propria lingua, and the median fibrous septum.
Where is that one? In the middle of your tongue or on the side?
The median fibrous septum is in the middle,
Like runs down the middle.
from the tip down to the root. Extends the whole length of the tongue internally. Okay, so landmarks. Now, there are both extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of the tongue. The tongue is this amazing structure. When you look at the lateral head x-rays of people talking, the tongue is just in constant motion, constantly changing its shape. It's all muscle. And it's a very complex combination of muscles that has a lot of ability to change its position in the oral cavity and the shape in the oral cavity. So it's a major articulator and very important. So the extrinsic muscles are the same as the other ones we've been talking about. Either the muscle origin or the insertion is outside of the tongue, and the other end of attachment is within the tongue. And then you have the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. Both the origin and insertion are within the structure of the tongue. Very complex muscle. Well, very complex body part. So let's talk about the extrinsic muscles of the tongue first. The first is the genioglossus. The origin of this muscle is right here on the mandible at a point that's called, now I included a slide later on so we could locate these landmarks on the jaw. The mental spines of the mandible. The mandible is your lower jaw, right? So it's the mental spines of the mandible inserts into, and it's a very big muscle, and inserts into the apex or the tip of the tongue, the blade of the tongue, the dorsum of the tongue, and the root of the tongue into the lingual aponeurosis. I guess I should have put that on that first slide too, the lingual aponeurosis, which is this part of the cover of the tongue. What does this muscle do? It can withdraw the tongue into the mouth. You also this wasn't listed. Oh, the hyoid bone, I did miss that right there. There's the hyoid. Withdraw the tongue into the mouth. You could actually pull the tongue tip down. You can lower the tongue, protrude. These are opposite. Protrude the tongue and withdraw it into the mouth are opposite functions. Pull the tongue root and dorsum anteriorly. It's because of these complex attachments that you can both protrude it and withdraw it. So the genioglossus is a very complex extrinsic muscle of the tongue.
Is this like a lateral? I don't
This is a
understand
lateral
this
view.
So is it bilateral or is it?
No,
going
it's
the whole bottom?
actually the whole bottom. It's really the whole
So
bottom.
it's
It's forming a big mass of the tongue. Yes, it's here in the middle. So it's not bilateral. It's a muscle. It's a big muscle mass in the middle, making up the floor of the mouth and the tongue. Okay, so that's the genioglossus. The styloglossus. We've heard stylo before, so the origin is the styloid process of the temporal bone. It is bilateral. It inserts, so here's the styloid process. It inserts into the side of the tongue, into these lateral margins of the tongue. Now you can see from this, the location of the tongue, it can retract or pull the tongue in and up, like that. So it can pull the entire tongue up. It can curl the sides of the tongue upwards. It's really interesting that some people can do that and some people can't. How many of you can curl your tongue up? But don't use your lips. You can't use your lips. Do just your tongue. You're not doing too good. There we go. There we go. So curl the sides of your tongue and draw it in all at the same time. Hard, but you've got a number of muscles that are doing this. Yes. Is that a question, or are you just holding up your hand? She's not sure. Okay, so that's the styloglossus. And here's the hyoglossus. So now this one, here's the hyoid bone. Here's the tongue. So the origin of the muscle is the hyoid, right? Which means you're going to stabilize the hyoid. Inserts into bilateral, inserts into the sides of the tongue and the lingual septum. And mixes with the intrinsic muscles of the tongue, which we haven't talked about yet. All of these fibers mix up. They're all mixed together. Okay? The function, retract the tongue, curl the sides of the tongue down. I don't think I can do that. I can't curl the sides of my tongue down with my lips open. Most of us can't do that, but you can when you're speaking. Curl the sides of your tongue down. Okay.
Like the opposite of like.
Curl the sides of your tongue down, but mostly because this is an extrinsic muscle, what it's mostly going to do is retract and pull the tongue down. Okay? Retract your tongue. So if you do it from a more oral frontal position, you can do it. That's the muscle that's retracting your tongue. Okay, the hyoglossus. Now, the general function of the extrinsic muscles of the tongue is to position the tongue within the oral cavity. Right? So if you think of your vowel quadrangle, what are the 4 points on the quadrangle? Well, good, I'm glad. Okay. And so that's great. So you can move the tongue to a high front, high back. High front, high back, right? Ah and ah. Ah, ah. Ah, ah. Ah, front low, ah, front back, or low back, right? So the general up high, up back, low front, low back, your extrinsic little muscles are controlling the general position of the tongue in the oral cavity. Now, at the same time, you're controlling this general position of the tongue in the oral cavity. You're making some very teeny little muscular adjustments with your intrinsic muscles of the tongue, which are the muscles that are responsible for the minute shape changes that we accomplish with our tongue. And the first one is the superior longitudinalis, painted in blue. The origin of the muscle is from the root of the tongue, and it runs all the way forward and inserts into the tip or the apex of the tongue. Now, the way you find the superior covers the whole top of the tongue. So it's not really a bilateral muscle. It's covering the whole top of the tongue. So if you're pushing on it, if you put your finger in your mouth, which I hate to do, unless I've just washed my hands. But if you press your finger on the top of your tongue, you're pressing on the superior longitudinalis underneath the cover, right? Okay, so what does it do? It can curl the tongue tip upward, can shorten the tongue, can possibly help to retract the tongue. And that is the superior longitudinalis. But I think the point on the superior longitudinalis for these minor shape changes and curling the tongue tip up a little bit. So if you have you gone over a retroflex R yet?
Mm-hmm.
So if you do a retroflex R and you've got your tongue tip up a little bit, you also have a little groove right behind that. So if you go roll, you're probably using the superior along with some other tongue. Who knows what they actually know? And studying the muscles in the tongue with needle electrodes doesn't work. Yeah, ouch. And it doesn't work. Inferior longitudinalis. Now look at this one painted in the red. Origin is the root of the tongue, and the muscle runs all the way up on that inferior surface of the tongue, up to the apex, function, curl the tongue tip down, shorten the tongue, possibly retract the tongue. And that's the inferior longitudinalis. Okay. The third one, a little hard to picture. No, you can picture it on the slide. Is the vertical muscle. The vertical muscle, the origin are these little muscle fibers along the inferior surface, all the way from, again, the apex back to the root. And the muscle fibers run up to the superior surface. You see that? They run up to the superior surface. That's the vertical muscle. So it runs all the way from the root to the apex, and the muscle fibers run from underneath the tongue to the top, flattening the tongue is the function. Yes? You're looking at these dark kind of grayish black fibers that are running from the undersurface of the tongue to the top, this way, all along the whole length of the tongue. Those little black fibers. That's the vertical muscle. Because all muscles are made up of a whole bunch of fibers, muscle fibers. The muscle itself is called the vertical muscle of the tongue. Yeah, I mean, okay, let's think about the meat. Think about eating a chicken. Okay, well, chickens don't have big tongues. But let's think about something else. Think about a cow tongue. Yeah, oh my God, those are huge. But if you look at it, the muscle, the tongue muscle, is made up of fibers. I mean, the muscle is made up of these individual fibers. All muscles are. The limb muscles are. Chicken, who eats chicken in here? How many of you eat chicken? Chicken. Muscle fibers, right? Yeah. Okay, we're going to move on. I'm not going to think about that. Okay, transverse muscle. Now, the transverse muscle is a little hard to see. You can't see it on this one, so I'm going to show you on my tongue. Okay, the transverse muscle. First, let's look. The origin is the lingua septum, which is basically that midline structure that runs the whole 9-finger tongue. Okay? And then the transverse fibers run from that middle structure out to the sides. Like that. The verticals run up like this. The transverse runs from side to side. So the origin is that midline structure in the tongue, and then they run out to basically attach into the cover of the tongue, the propria lingua. And what does it do when you contract those muscles that are running transversely? It narrows and bunches the tongue and makes it longer. So, okay, what's the general function of the intrinsic tongue muscles? Changing the detailed shape of the tongue. And so the intrinsic laryngeal muscles are associated. Did I say laryngeal?
Yeah.
The intrinsic muscles of the tongue are associated with consonant production, whereas the extrinsic muscles of the tongue are more associated with vowel production, right? Because the vowel production, you've got to have those different locations within the oral cavity. Okay, and that was the transverse muscle. I'm sorry. I can't, you can't identify this in class. You can look at it. Find a picture of your own to just look at how the muscles of the jaw and the tongue